Hello everybody, I am doing this video because I thought that not only would it make things easier for other people, it would also make things easier for me because I would not have to do a blog instead. So I'm doing this video and I'm going to explain why I'm doing all of these weird diet ideas. So here's the basic setup. I want to understand the metabolic consequences isocalorically, same protein, same everything, except for fat and carbohydrate. Say maybe 5% carbohydrate on the ketogenic version of the diet, or maybe perhaps 40 to 50 grams or less, which is probably going to end up being less than 5% carbohydrate because my calorie intake is so high. And take that diet and put that head-to-head against a high carbohydrate diet consisting, say, of 70 to 80% carbohydrate. And what are the effects going to be on my fasting blood glucose, on my insulin levels, on my lipids, and on my inflammatory markers, and on my performance, on my cognition, on my sleep, on my rate of muscle growth, fat gain, all that other kind of stuff. What are the effects of these two diets going to be if we stack them head-to-head in free living conditions over a long-term period? That's never been studied in humans. So doing it basically for the first time would be, I think, very interesting. A secondary question is, what if I'm doing the ketogenic diet in a plant-based way? And then doing that compared to a basically plant-based high-carb diet. It's not vegan, I'm not a vegan, but I think that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence for the healthfulness of a plant-based, mostly non-animal product approach to eating. So I wanted to see how those two diets would stack up to each other, and I wanted to see how well a plant-based version of the ketogenic diet would work. I started thinking about this, I think, in June of this year. It is now September, and I said it would take maybe 3 to 6 months to do a pilot. It's going to take significantly longer just because life gets in the way, but I am making progress constantly. There's a lot of other secondary questions I'm also thinking about looking at, and as I go through this process, I'm actually getting very deep into both historical and contemporary literature on metabolism and how it affects pathogenesis of disease. So yeah, that's the plan. 5% carbohydrate versus 70 to 80% carbohydrate. What are the health effects going to be? What are the performance and body composition effects going to be if I keep the calories the same? How do I feel, et cetera, et cetera. Recently I did a wheat experiment because I'm not sure why my joint pain went away after I stopped eating wheat. Was it some other change I made besides the wheat, or was it the wheat itself? I added the wheat back in. I ate a very high wheat diet, maybe 50% plus, and my calories were coming from bread. And what happened was my joint pain got quite bad, and my knocks and bangs and all that kind of stuff that are happening from my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training are not going away. I keep feeling joint pain in joints after they take a minor bang up. I keep feeling them constantly, and they're not going away. It's not like it's like the joint pain or the random pain in my body. It's not healing. So I don't believe it, and I don't think I should believe it. I don't think the scientific view is to believe it. I think that the practical view is, hey, something works, do it, and that's great. And I can't tell anybody to do anything different. I encourage people to do that. But the scientific view is, if I'm getting this change in my joints based on restricting wheat, why? Is it because I believe I'm restricting wheat and therefore it feels a lot better, or is it because the wheat restriction itself is actually making it feel better? It's unknown. The connection between the brain and the immune system is extraordinary. The science on this has been both fascinating me and baffling me, and I don't think people understand exactly how strong this connection, how well established in the science this connection is through carefully controlled experiments. And I think if people did understand this a little bit better, and if this was made a little bit more widely known in the popular media and in the social media, people would be a little more hesitant about saying, oh, this or that particular intervention definitely helped me, even though I have no evidence for it. It may have helped you, but it may also be mediated by psychoneurological factors. So that's one thing I want to rule out, and in order to rule that out for the wheat and the joint pain issue, I need to have objective biomarkers. Okay, so I don't know what objective biomarkers to look at for wheat and joint pain right now, because I've looked at a lot of the studies. They do show some very interesting biomarkers that are associated with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. I can't find those particular biomarkers commercially available. I looked at some other things that haven't been shown to correlate with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, even though they theoretically might. I'm sitting here and waiting until I find a strong answer in the literature before I start spending hundreds or thousands of dollars and trying to establish this in myself. It would be very interesting to establish it and to tell a story, and that's essentially why I'm doing all of this. Look, one reason to be doing this is because this hasn't been done in humans. Another reason to do this is because people like to see particular outcomes and results in a more narrative format. We can always link abstracts all day long, but until it's a real human being, a lot of people, and myself included, find it a little bit less compelling than actually hearing a real-life story. That shouldn't be the case, however it is, because that's the way human beings tend to think about things. So if I could take a self-experiment for myself, report the results, integrate that with the literature, what the literature says, and or even in some cases, if I can find and rule out other explanations, sometimes even challenge the literature, I think that could be very helpful for people. Now, people do have this question about whether N=1 experiments are legitimate. They think you need a bunch of different people in a clinical trial and to establish results. It's not necessarily true. And I want to be very clear about this, just because I get into arguments about this with people, and I think that other people, my belief, based on my current level of knowledge, is that most people don't know what they're talking about when they're talking about N=1. So let's be clear. N=1 so-called experiments, if you're just sort of changing your diet and seeing what happens, it's not an experiment. It's not going to give you good data. It's an anecdote, and it's a very low quality of data. However, there are versions of N=1 experiments that can be quite high quality and actually have established things scientifically, especially when they've been aggregated. Now, these versions require a great amount of control. They require a very careful protocol to run. It's not something you should just do, pulling random speculations out your ear. It's something that you need to do with careful planning and careful control. Now, what does that mean? That means when you do the intervention, everything needs to be controlled in your life except for that intervention. Okay, you can't necessarily do that, and you probably can't even do that on a metabolic ward if we're talking about a nutrition study, but you can take great care to control everything besides the particular intervention that might be relevant. And in this particular case, that includes sleep, amount of exercise, and that includes logging all of these things as well. It includes clamping calories, clamping protein, which means keeping a constant between each intervention that I'm going to be trying. It means trying to even control stress levels, monitoring those as well, say with an Oura ring, which looks at HRV, which is thought to be a good sign of parasympathetic activity or a good biomarker of parasympathetic activity. So, but that's not enough. Then you do your next arm of the study. So say I start with a high-carb diet, and then I switch to a ketogenic diet. I keep all of these things constant. I do that. And I do that for the same amount of time, and I do the biomarker tests at the same period, say after 3 months of each diet, so that everything is tightly controlled. So that's still not enough. And the reason is you probably need to do each of these phases over again. In the literature, this is called an AB format, where you do a second cycle of each of those things in order to really try to control for things that can change. I mean, seasonally, for crying out loud, things that can change in life circumstances that could confound things. AB is very strong, but of course AB would be strongest, and I think that strikes me as pretty conclusive. So what can we say if you find a result in this sort of AB format where each time you do an intervention, you find the same result? So that, let's say, for example, I do a ketogenic diet, my LDL cholesterol goes sky high. And then I switch to a plant-based high-carb diet, and then it drops. Switch back to the ketogenic diet, goes sky high again, same level. Plant-based high-carb drops. Do it over again, one last cycle, same result each time. So 3 times each direction. That's actually not showing the same thing 3 times. It's showing the same thing 5 times because the idea isn't that you're not. The idea is when you go from one diet to another, it's actually the transition between those 2 diets. That's the intervention. So you're intervening in one direction from A to B, from keto to non-keto, and you're also having, in a certain sense, an intervention from B to A, just keto to non-keto, which is basically the reverse of the first intervention. So if you think of it as the reverse of the first intervention, then you're actually doing the same intervention. It's just doing A, B, A twice. It's just you're doing it in opposite directions. So when you're doing A, B, A, B, A, B, you're doing the same intervention 5 times. Okay. So that said, what can I actually discover from that kind of process? Well, I can know with a high degree of confidence that, at least for me, this sort of intervention achieves this sort of effect. What can I say about how that generalizes for other people? Not as much. However, the more we're starting to understand about the genetic code, and especially about SNPs, about the genome, the human genome, and the more we're able to have at our disposal techniques that allow us to determine what the relevant genetic differences are between, say, me and the general population through these sorts of techniques like 23andMe, etc., I can actually start to profile what might be the relevant genetic differences between me and other people that might make my results less generalizable than they would otherwise be. So what that means is, in theory, and we're not quite there yet, but we will be, I think, pretty soon. If we're, in many ways we're there. In every way that could be important, we're not. But I can look at the gross genetic differences between myself and the rest of the population and see if those are potentially relevant to explain maybe some sort of result that I have. And then I can not make a definitive conclusion about whether or not my results are generalizable, but I can rule out all kinds of things that would make my results perhaps not generalizable without necessarily being able to rule out everything. So there's that extra degree of control. And the other thing to think about is whenever you look at these nutrition studies, it depends on the biomarker that you're looking at. But for a lot of biomarkers, the differences between people aren't that significant. So yes, there is a lot of variability between people, but in general, the biomarkers tend to go in the same directions. It depends on, again, what we're talking about. They tend to go in the same directions, but then if you also add 2 that basic principle, this extra layer of genetic control that I just mentioned, and try to explain potential confounders, genetic confounders of my results using these particular tools, it gives us a little bit more confidence that the small amounts of variation in some particular biomarkers are going to be less relevant. But again, I doubt that in many cases the differences between individuals are so extreme that I'm going to be getting the opposite results on most of these biomarker tests than everybody else. I think I'm probably going to be, statistically speaking, average. Although, we need to look at the genetics to maybe take that into account, and there's a lot of stuff we don't know about epigenetics as well, so there's no guarantee. But it's evidence, and it's certainly much better evidence than anecdotes, and it has a different set of strengths and weaknesses compared to clinical trials, which might be more short-term and might have less control. So for every bit of evidence, there is advantages and disadvantages. Let me point out one potential additional problem with this particular kind of way of studying things, and that is blinding. So we were just talking about the weed issue where, I don't know if the weed is causing my problems. I want an objective biomarker, right? So because that's the reason for that is placebo, right? Placebo and pain, there's such a tight connection between the two, and there's such a great degree to which placebo can modulate pain response that we want to be really sure whenever I see a change in pain in response to, say, weed consumption, I'm not just making up in my head and spreading more, basically, weed hysteria on the internet, which I could be just by making this video, but my hope is that by cautioning people and talking about the potential problems with the results that I'm finding in my own anecdotes, I'm helping to inform people not only about the things that might actually be the case, but also the problems with self-report and problems with my particular self-report. Okay, so that said, let's think a little bit more about placebo in the case of wheat. So in the case of wheat, one thing that I can do to try to control for that is to try to blind myself. So how do I blind myself? Basically, I can't exactly blind myself, but I can have somebody else blind me. So I can have somebody else who wants to participate in my N=1 experiment blind me to my own intervention. And how would we do that? So let's say I have a random 0-1 generator, or just say a yes. Look, I have a computer that will randomly, when you press one of its buttons, it'll tell you the output. It'll give you an output that says yes or no, and it'll give you that output randomly. So it'll randomly tell you yes or no. If you push a button on a computer and it pops on the screen yes or no, depending upon the random generator in the computer. Okay? So then I give that to say my wife, and my wife presses the button and she gets yes or no. And if it's yes, she gives me wheat, and if it's no, she gives me pea protein. And we make the wheat and the pea protein formulation taste and look and feel exactly the same. So that each day she gives me whatever the computer told her to give me, and I don't know any different. Okay? So one way we can do that is I can make all those shakes by myself, or she can, if she has the time to do it, she probably doesn't, she can make them. So what I'll do is I'll probably make all the shakes by myself. It's probably not even going to take that long. Assuming I can make them all taste and look exactly the same. And in order to do that, I'll use some sort of flavorant and some sort of color that will mask and hopefully the texture is similar. I don't know. These are a whole bunch of problems to think about. But if we can make those the same, and especially maybe if I can dissolve them in a shake, I think that would work to really equalize the texture. So it would be just maybe indistinguishable. So I'd mix them with bananas. And then my wife would randomize, and then she'd just basically give me whichever shake I'm supposed to receive, or I would give basically all the shakes to her. She would mark them with different numbers and not tell me which one. Then use the yes/no generator to select the number, and then give me the number. So that's how that would work. Then I would see if I have pain. So I'd say take the shake with the wheat in it for a month, and then take the shake with the pea in it for a month, the pea protein, by the way. And then I would drink both of them, for a month each, and then I would record my findings for each. And then we would know what the pain looks like. And if the pain looked worse in the wheat, without me even knowing it, that would be a significant amount of evidence to suggest there's something about the wheat protein that's making my problems happen. So we might do something like that until I can find a good biomarker in the literature. All right, so these are sorts of things I'm working on. One other thing I'm working on is I'm just interested in what is the effect of fiber on ketogenesis? What is the effect on polyunsaturated fatty acids versus saturated fatty acids for ketogenesis? Because there's some evidence that polyunsaturated fatty acids should be more ketogenic. So this is the sort of rationale of these experiments. I think this is really cool because it forces me to think about things in a way that I would that I wouldn't otherwise. It forces me to go start reading literature that I wouldn't otherwise read to try to explain things that I think are interesting. It gets me really familiar with these particular diets, and that helps me to be able to help patients who are interested in these kinds of diets. It informs people about the possibilities of a plant-based ketogenic diet as opposed to an animal-based ketogenic diet. How reasonable is it? How sustainable is it? Does it work as well? What do the biomarkers look like? Another particular experiment that we might be able to do is we might be able to look at the differences between plant-based ketogenic diet and, say, more of a carnivore ketogenic diet. That's not something I want to do immediately. I feel a little bit hesitant to try something like that. One of the people that follows me that sent me a message recently told me is that they did a carnivore diet and they had their runs 5 times a day, and they also had blood coming out that end as well. Now, they said that they felt amazing, right? So apart from bleeding, apart from a bleeding ass, basically, they said that they felt amazing on the ketogenic carnivore diet, but and their skin was all clear. They could sleep amazingly. They lost weight, etc. But they had that downside. That really concerns me. Okay, so I told this person, okay, try, and so they started adding fruits and vegetables, and it all went away, all that bad stuff, and their skin started getting bad again, their sleep started getting bad again. So yeah, they've treated one problem for another. I think that's very fascinating. It just shows how much we don't understand about the human body, but it also makes me really reluctant to try a carnivore diet. One of the things I told this person to try was, hey, don't just try isolated, don't just try fruits and vegetables, but also try isolated fibers as well. So there's a few things that you can try. Try psyllium fiber, you can try guar gum, you can try xanthan gum, and see what the effect of each of these fibers does, and see if it's actually the fiber that's reversing these things. Because he says that it happens within 1 or 2 days. You get the reversal of the terrible gastrointestinal problems. One of the interesting things was this person got drunk and ate a bunch of Tostitos, and that solved the problem. So is it necessarily a fiber problem? I'm sure there's some fiber in Tostitos, but not a whole lot. So I wanted to figure out what the effects of that were, and they say that they might try these things out. We'll see what happens. But I do feel a little bit hesitant about trying a carnivore diet for precisely this reason. I mean, geez, do I want to be undergoing that? Might it do permanent damage to my microbiome? I don't know. So, but it is an interesting thing to try, and for science and for public education, I might do something like that. That's down the road. And the reason it's down the road, another reason, is that I don't want to do too many things at once. I want to isolate one variable at a time, deal with it, play around with it, figure it out in depth, then go on to the next thing. And that's the goal. Anything else? Blood glucose and ketone levels. I'm looking at that as well. I just kind of had a cash windfall. That's really amazing. And I might get a CGM pretty soon and some other cool gear that will help me to do this. Right now, I'm entering what I would call the second phase of my pilot. I've gotten really accustomed to these diets. I know exactly what they're going to look like. At least I think getting pretty close to doing it. For the high-carb diet, the ketogenic diet's a little bit more difficult. Why? Because I ran into serious motivation problems on the ketogenic diet. I don't know if that was psychological or not. I've never stayed home and not gone to work before, because I didn't want to go. I accidentally just stopped that, and it's not because I wanted to edit out I stopped going to work. I stopped going to it's not work. I stopped going to lab for a week, and I couldn't get the motivation to do it. I lost a lot of motivation. I don't know what that was. That was really weird to me. Because it could have been that it was plant-based, but it could have been that I couldn't eat any calories. I stopped feeling like eating any calories because, we'll talk about that in a moment. But what was the reason that I was not able to, that I stopped going to work? And one thing that I found was looking at Kevin Hall's study, and actually several different studies, including I think Finney and maybe even Finney and Volek, one of their early studies in the 1980s, is that it's that people who go on ketogenic diets, they tend to get, sometimes it's quite overwhelming in effect, is their T3 drops, sometimes by as much as 25 to 50%. So their T3 is dropping even when they're eating the same amount of calories. And apparently the T4 goes up and the TSH goes up as well. And 1/6 of children on a ketogenic diet treating intractable epilepsy, they see a diagnosis of subclinical hypothyroidism, which is defined as a TSH level above 10. There's some controversy about this category and whether or not you should treat it, et cetera, but it is a sign that thyroid function is going down. They didn't look at, in this particular study, I think it was a Turkish study, they didn't look at the T3, but they saw the TSH went up, and they've seen the T3 gone down in several different studies. And mechanistically it makes sense. We know that the conversion of T4 to T3 happens via insulin. What doesn't make sense as much to me is that insulin shouldn't be going down that much. According to Kevin Hall's study, but however, it wasn't that long of a period of time, so I don't know, maybe the insulin would have gone down even more, but according to Kevin Hall's study, the insulin levels didn't go down by more than, I think, 1 or 2 international units. That's not that much. It only went down 25% or less. It was 15%. So should that cause that effect? It could have been the longer term. So is my thyroid dropping, and I'm losing motivation because I'm basically becoming hypothyroid? That's something else I need to test. I need to look at my thyroid hormone. I need to look at my what's called RT3. It's thought that RT3 goes up and T3 goes down. So that was one problem I ran into, and I need to deal with that. And one way that I'm going to have to try to deal with that is, looking at my T3, I'm also going to limit my study to 1 month so I don't end up losing my space at my PhD program. And and then the other problem was the palatability issue. Listen, nuts are great, but I'm eating about 4,000 calories a day. I can't eat pepitas all day long. I cannot eat it, and I can do it for a day. I can do it for a couple days. I can't do it day after day after day after day after day. And at some point, it just became onerous to drink gigantic quantities of oil and pepitas and whatever else I was putting in those shakes. I was posting a lot of logs, so food logs. So I just can't eat those foods all the time in such a gigantic quantity. So one thing I have to work on for my next cycle of keto, which I'm probably going to do in about a month, as I've been talking about my sort of phase 2, is I need to really make sure I can do this long term, or at least for a month. If I shorten the study length to a month, I think I should be able to do it. But I need to work on palatability issues. But that's the other problem. If it's not palatable for people and people aren't going to want to do it for a long time, then it's not. I mean, why am I even? for strictly scientific reasons, it's interesting. But one of the goals here is to show that a plant-based ketogenic diet is possible in the long term. Now, maybe it's only possible for people who eat a normal amount of calories. That's certainly a reasonable supposition. All right, well, that said, let me talk about a little bit about how I felt on the ketogenic diet versus the high-carb diet. I felt amazing on keto. I lost a lot of fatigability. I was able to stay up for later hours without feeling fatigued at all. I stopped napping. And I felt like super clear, and I also had a lower anxiety and a sort of lower, I don't know how to call it, a lower perturbability. During that time, people on Twitter thought I sounded angry. I was not angry. I think they just were offended that I was actually felt I was much funnier than I was before, because I felt very relaxed, and I just let I just let it fly, and I felt great, and my anxiety level was low. I felt very unperturbable. I felt all those things. When I switched back to high-carb diet, one of the interesting things was I suddenly replicated those effects that I really felt, especially at the beginning of the ketogenic diet. I replicated those effects on the high-carb diet, which suggests that it's not so much the diet, but maybe the change of diet that somehow brings about either placebo effects or some sort of hormetic or stress response that jacks up your norepinephrine, where you're adapting to a new diet and you feel great. I don't know which one it is. I guess there's ways to look at that and test that a little bit. I have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah, and one of the interesting things about switching back to a high-carb diet after being on a ketogenic diet was I didn't have any need for naps, just the same way as it was when I first switched on a ketogenic diet. However, this changed when I switched from eating wheat to eating potatoes or lentils. Now, lentils shouldn't create as much of a glucose response, although I need to test that more carefully. Certainly, potatoes will probably create more of a glucose response, and that might have something to do with it. But with wheat, I had no fatigability. I was not feeling tired after a meal at all whatsoever. And I thought that was very interesting, how I'm not sure if it's the wheatness of the diet or if it's the switching that caused it. As I've said, I'm off of wheat as a practical matter until I experiment further and maybe have a better idea of the biomarkers, but it is a very interesting thing that maybe it's not carbohydrate dependent. It may be the type of carbohydrate dependent, what effects you have on the on sort of postprandial somnolence, as we might call it. Oh, geez, I think I'm finished with that. I can't think of anything else I want to talk about. I am exhausted, as you can tell. That's why I didn't want to write a blog post, because I'm tired. It's been really actually quite a great video, I think, and I hope people have found that this is useful and are interested in the diet experiment that I am currently in the process of undertaking. I will post. Here's a commitment. I will post over the next few weeks my blood glucose levels in response to meals, and I will very closely track that, because I was doing that on keto, and I need to be doing that on this. We are ending the first phase of the trial. What this basically consists of is figuring out exactly how many calories I'm going to need, what my macros are going to look like, how I can make this sustainable, and how I can very consistently and reliably track all that is going on, including my blood glucose, ketone levels, weight, body fat percentage, calories, all that stuff. And of course, at the end of each cycle, I also want to have blood drawn. And I am getting used to these diets, and that is the purpose of this phase 1. Phase 2 will be to make sure that I have everything down pat and tight. And if I don't, then the trial cannot happen. So whenever I start the ketogenic diet, I'm going to be basically running it for real. But again, during this phase 2, I really need to figure out this palatability issue, but I do think that what I'm going to do is, if I can do it just for 1 month, which isn't that much of a commitment. It's actually, I only think I did keto for 3 months last time. If I do this for 1 month, it might be less of a problem, the palatability issues. However, I do need to figure those out, because I want this diet to be something other people can use, and that may require me incorporating more plant-based or animal-based proteins or animal products, including eggs, for example. I'm not going to eat chicken or pork, and the reason is because chickens and pigs are not treated well in factory farms. No matter if you have like an organic one or whatever anybody calls them, almost universally pigs and chickens are mistreated. There might be some exceptions. For chickens, there's very few. So I still eat beef occasionally. I eat beef liver every weekend, whether or not I'm on a ketogenic or non-ketogenic diet, and the reason for that is very simple. Beef has a lot of nutrients, and a lot of nutrients that people need. I also supplement with creatine, and I'm playing around with taurine, and I noticed some very interesting effects with taurine. There's a gigantic literature by the Japanese. The Japanese have this huge like taurine research subfield that is almost non-existent in the States, as far as I'm aware. It's very interesting to look at. The Japanese do all sorts of really weird and interesting things that we don't think to do, which is totally important for us to be looking more into. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So blood glucose ketone levels, we're going to do that over the next 2 weeks. I'm also going to be sharing more dietary logs, and I just want you guys to know what I'm doing, because people keep asking. They don't understand why I'm posting some of these things, because they weren't following me, I guess, a few months ago. I skipped over one thing I just realized is I want to be very clear about what the whole food plant-based diet consists of. It's no sugar, no oil, extremely low in fat, and low in processed foods, and it's going to probably be mostly lentil and potato and banana-based with some supplemental protein, plant-based protein mostly. I've left out a couple things, but we'll have to cover them some other time. Thanks for watching.